My name is Mick Harrison. I'm a lawyer. I've been a public interest lawyer for 25 years, and I appreciate the invitation to come and speak with you all from your Colorado 9/11 Truth Group, which I've been very impressed with their efforts on the issues out here. Most of you know, but some of you may not, that I am the vice chair of a relatively new organization, a nonprofit, called the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. We're a 501c3 tax-deductible nonprofit, and our goal is to promote two things: transparency and accountability regarding the events of September 11th, 2001. And those two concepts, transparency and accountability, involve a number of things. I'll unpack that a little bit as we go through the discussion. What I'm going to try to do is use about half of our time giving you information that I know that you may not have heard, and then in the last half I hope to have a discussion with you all and take questions, and maybe you can inform me on some things I don't know. But I prefer to have the dialogue rather than to simply be speaking at you. So now if you have a really urgent question, sort of either a clarification or something that seems to fit right with what I'm talking about, I won't be offended if you raise your hand. I can call on you even while I'm doing the preliminary stuff. If I don't want to lose my train of thought, I might wait a moment before calling on you. So don't be shy. If there's something you really feel like you need to say, raise your hand and we'll let you say it. So let me give you an overview of what I intend to talk about in the first part. In the second part, you do not need to feel restricted to my topics. If there's something about 9/11 that you feel like you want to ask me about, it's fine to do so, whether it fits on my topics list or not. So what I want to talk about is intended to give you all an update on where the Lawyers Committee stands in looking at legal issues, legal strategies for accomplishing these two goals: bringing out more of the truth about 9/11 and ultimately holding responsible those who may have engaged in crimes related to 9/11. And some of you may know what I'm talking about, and some of you may not yet know what I'm talking about, and before this session is over, hopefully you all will know what I'm talking about there. So there have been some new developments, and we build this event as a talk about recent legal breakthroughs, and some of you may think that that might be a bit premature to call these developments breakthroughs, or maybe a bit overstated. I won't criticize you if you hold that opinion, but there's a reason why we called these new developments breakthroughs, and I'm going to try to unpack that for you as we go along so you'll understand what I consider to be the significance of these new events. So one of the recent developments that many of you probably know about by now is the release of what's called the 28 pages. And this was a portion of the joint congressional inquiry into the events of 9/11 that the two intelligence committees, the House and the Senate, engaged in 2002. But there were 28 pages of their report that were never made public. The rest of the report was made public, but these 28 pages were kept secret for 15 years. And there was an ongoing, long-standing advocacy effort by folks in the 9/11 Truth Movement to get those 28 pages released to the public. And they were released to the public last year, finally, after some effort. Now, there were a lot of people involved in that effort. I got involved only because Barb Honegger, some of you know Barb as an investigator on 9/11 issues, an investigative reporter, she asked me to look at the question of whether the 28 pages could legally be kept secret. Are we okay?
Yeah.
Could be louder.
Could be louder?
Yes.
I'll do my part and we'll see if he can do his
I
part.
can do
By
that.
getting
The
closer.
Getting closer?
The more we get.
I think we're okay. I'll stay closer to Mike.
Yeah, I just don't want feedback.
Not a problem. So let me know if you can't hear me. So what happened was, some of you know Les Jamison from New York 9/11 Truth Group. He was working with some Congress folks and family members of the victims. And Barb was working with some of those folks. And Barb asked me to do a legal analysis of the question of the legality of keeping these 28 pages secret. At the time when it was first brought to me, we thought that the executive branch had classified these 28 pages as secret in the interest of national security, and that there might have been a legal basis for them doing that. As it turns out, to make a long story short, the document is owned by Congress, not by the executive branch, and neither the CIA or the FBI or the NSA had the power to classify any of those 28 pages secret or otherwise restricted. Only Congress could do that. Now, it turned out, no offense to members of Congress, that a lot of the members of Congress didn't understand that they owned this document and that the executive branch couldn't tell them what to do with it. So I wrote this 30-page legal analysis, which was intended to be a law review article. And former Senator Mike Gravel, some of you my age or older may remember the Pentagon Papers, and Senator Gravel at the time read those papers into the congressional record, even though they were classified. And it took some courage for him to do that, and the DOJ did try to prosecute him, unsuccessfully as it turned out. And the reason is that the Constitution protects members of Congress engaged in doing their jobs from any legal challenge. It's called the Speech or Debate Clause. And so members of Congress cannot be prosecuted for what they say in doing their job, including if they choose to talk about classified information, even if it were classified by the executive branch. So members of Congress have the right to be whistleblowers in that regard and cannot be prosecuted if they do. So Senator Gravel was one of the most famous examples of the exercise of that right. Well, Senator Gravel was in communication with me and the folks trying to get these 28 pages released, and I provided my analysis to the senator, and he provided it to a number of members of Congress. And not too long after that, there was a 60 Minutes program on the 28 pages, and then there was a release of the documents. So those pages are now out there. You can find them on the web. And the short version of the importance of those 28 pages is that they show connections between Saudi officials and Saudi nationals in terms of assistance, financing to some of the hijackers. And that wasn't talked about when the 9/11 Commission was doing its job. It wasn't talked about when the FBI was trying to, track down, or the CIA was trying to track down the culprits. And when President Bush was talking about, the U.S. was going to go after any country harboring or giving aid or assistance to the hijackers, the Saudis were not in the conversation. So now, 15 years later, they are in the conversation. And so that's one of the new developments. Now, those 28 pages are relevant to an existing lawsuit. I'm not involved in that lawsuit, but a couple of large law firms brought a lawsuit for a number of family members of the victims against the Saudis. And that lawsuit is pending. It's in progress as we speak. I can't tell you exactly how that's going to go. It's interesting from the point of view that they now have a little more evidence to work with because the 28 pages have been released. But the theories used by the law firms in that case are more consistent with the official story than they are consistent with some issues that my organization is looking at, which would be, for example, the possibility that the 3 buildings that collapsed on September 11th were brought down by explosives, not by being hit by airplanes. And that's not part of the official story. So the current litigation for the family members may have a boost now from the 28 pages, but I wouldn't rely on that particular lawsuit to bring out more of the truth about what really happened, because its focus is more, the Saudis helped the 19 hijackers fly the planes into the buildings. So I hope that brings some relief to the family members, but it's probably not all that is needed legally to bring the full truth out about what happened. Now, another one of the recent developments was the passage by Congress of a law called JASTA. I believe that's an acronym, JASTA, for Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. And the reason that law was important, also for this pending lawsuit, is that it did 3 things that otherwise would have been a roadblock to this type of litigation. It eliminated immunity, which otherwise would have prevented foreign nationals from being sued, particularly foreign officials, including the Saudis. It extended the statute of limitations, which normally would have run years ago for most of these types of civil litigations. Statute of limitations typically are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, and after which you can't sue. However, because of the statute, persons injured on 9/11 or their family members can still sue until basically January 2nd of 2019. So the remainder of this year and all of next year is still available for victims in any sense, of the events that happened 15 years ago. And that's unusual in the legal system. It's an opportunity Congress has given. It may have been intended mainly to help suits such as the suit against the Saudis, but it does open the door for other civil litigation on any theory that can be proven for any person who's been victimized in any way, including anyone who was killed or injured by the use of explosives in the buildings, if the use of explosives could be proven. So that is a significant development because the door is now open. Most folks probably thought the chance of litigation on this has long since passed. And in some ways, yes. But the terrorism statute, which is one of the major federal statutes giving a vehicle for victims of terrorism to sue, can still be used for the remainder of this year and all of next year in a civil lawsuit for damages because of JASTA. And the other thing that JASTA did was it broadened liability. There was already some liability for those who aided or assisted a terrorist acts, but that liability was broadened by this law. So now there aren't really any loopholes. If someone, let's just take the hypothetical that our organization is looking at the evidence on, which is the possibility that these buildings, 3 buildings that collapsed, were brought down by the use of explosives. If that were true, then under this law, any person who was engaged in planting the explosives, conspiring to plant the explosives, aiding or abetting the folks who planted the explosives beforehand or after the fact, any of those folks and all of them would have liability. And they would have criminal liability as well as civil liability. And those folks could be sued without a statute of limitations problem for another year and a half, which is one reason our organization is looking at what civil litigation options are available to victims and maybe to the general public to, 1, bring more of the truth out, and 2, to get some accountability in terms of who the real wrongdoers are. So that's a significant new development. Now, a third new development has to do with a Freedom of Information Act case, which I am working on. I'm representing one of our board members, David Cole, who is a FOIA researcher of long standing. And David has submitted a number of Freedom of Information Act requests over the years. Most of you probably know what the Freedom of Information Act is, or what a FOIA request is. FOIA is the acronym, FOIA. For those who don't, for folks in this country, we have the benefit of the statute, which lets us access the records of our government with very few limitations. There are some limitations. For example, ongoing criminal investigations tend to be exempt. There are some national security exemptions if legitimately applied. But generally speaking, you can ask any federal agency for their records on any topic you wish, and they have to give them to you under this law. And if they don't, you can sue them and force them to give the records. And that's what this suit is about. Now, this particular suit is against FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. You might wonder, what's that got to do with 9/11? And the answer is, those are the 2 agencies that did the studies on why the buildings collapsed on 9/11. And in those studies, they basically ignored the evidence of explosives. And they came up with, for the towers, alternative explanations, which since then a number of independent scientists have critiqued and found to be scientifically wanting. Coming in. And so these studies haven't been accepted by the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, the group that we had present evidence to us. Some of you may have been there last September in New York, where we had a symposium. And we had the architects and engineers and a number of scientists present to us the evidence, unfortunately, that was very compelling, that the 2 towers and Building 7 collapsed because of the use of explosives. And as much as I would like to not believe that, coming away from that presentation, I couldn't find a valid basis for disagreeing with them. And at some point during the presentation here, we'll talk about some of those details. But I've identified myself 20 categories of evidence that I find very compelling scientific evidence that these buildings were brought down by the use of explosives. So what David Cole did in his FOIA was he asked FEMA, actually, to start with, for all their what he called raw data available to the agency in doing its study of the collapse of the building. So he wanted to see the photographs, the videos, the field investigation reports, scientific analyses of samples, anything that would have been used to analyze to determine what the cause of the collapse of the buildings was. We already have the report. The report is public from the agency, but what David wanted was the underlying evidence that either supported or perhaps didn't support their conclusions. So he submitted this FOIA request. It took, as it often does, a while for the agency to respond to him, and eventually, though, they did indicate that they'd located a number of records. Now, the reason it took time, and this is highly unusual, FEMA first told him they had no records at all responsive to his request. Now, think about that for a moment. His request was all the data used to do your study, and they said, we have nothing. And that itself raises a big question, at least to me as a lawyer it does. Now, however, the reason was we gave all of our records to NIST, another agency. Now, keep in mind this was 2001, 2002, maybe 2003. We're in the computer age at this point, okay? How do you give all of your records to another agency in a way that you're left with nothing? You can give them copies. You can send them copies of your emails, maybe copies of your backup tapes, copies of your hard copies. You could even send them your original hard copies. But how do you send them your original electronic copies without working very, very hard at it? You'd have to not only send stuff to them, but then delete everything you had, and which isn't necessary to give NIST what they want. So it was a very uncredible and incredible response. So, but they said, we're going to forward your request to NIST because we gave them everything and have them respond. So then NIST did say, yeah, we've located a bunch of these records. And they talked back and forth between FEMA and NIST and said, well, okay, we've identified so many thousands of pages, and most of those are releasable, not exempt. And so, they can be released to David Cole. And then 2 years later, he still didn't have the records, even after they determined they were releasable. And we have the documents where they said this. So he did, sort of the last resort. He tried to find a lawyer to sue. And at that point, he and I were both involved in the new organization, Lawyers Committee. And so he asked if I would look at it, and I did. And it looked like a perfectly valid complaint. So we recruited co-counsel in D.C., and we did bring a federal complaint in the district court in the District of Columbia. And that case is pending. Shortly after we filed the lawsuit, FEMA gave up thousands of pages of documents to us. They could have done that years ago, but it took the lawsuit to prompt them to do that. But then when David went through the records, there were some conspicuous omissions, things that hadn't been produced. Certain drawings, for example, drawings of the buildings at the floors where the agencies say the collapse began, which are the drawings you would particularly have to look at to try to determine whether their scientific explanation made sense or not. There were photographs taken after the collapse of the steel and so forth. There were videos. There were CDs, compact discs, full of records that were transferred back and forth. We have the correspondence showing all these records exist, and some of them were referred to in FEMA's final report, so we know they exist. But they weren't produced to us even after we sued. So we went through a period of negotiation with the agency saying, look, we have reason to believe A, B, and C exist. You didn't give us A, B, and C. Why don't you give us A, B, and C? And so they gave us some additional information, but the key stuff, they said, we can't find it. We don't have it. Now, those things are things that really would be hard to do the report they did if they didn't actually have those things. So, and they did apparently exist, so something happened to that information, and we're trying to find out what happened to it. Now, typically in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, it's not like a normal lawsuit for damages where you get to do discovery and subpoena your opponent and depose them and get all the records, which is normal in civil litigation. In FOIA cases, you don't normally get to do that. And the reason is it's considered to be a case on the agency record, and the agency makes a motion for summary judgment, it's called. They submit affidavits from their people who theoretically know what happened to the records, and then the complainant, in our case David Cole, the plaintiff, gets a chance to respond in opposition, and the judge then decides, do I believe the agency's explanation? Did they do a thorough search? Did they find all they can find, or not? And if it's or not, then they're violating the law, and the judge orders them to do something further. And that's normally the end of it in a FOIA case. Occasionally, if you prove bad faith by the agency or inconsistencies in the agency's explanations, the judge will let you do some discovery even in a FOIA case. So we had a hearing in this case recently in DC for the judge, and I explained to him what I've explained to you and a couple details I have yet to tell you. One of which was, after we gave the agency a list of what was missing in their production to us, they came back and said, oh, well, we can't find these things, but FEMA folks think it may be in a Region 2 off-site warehouse, and we'll send a couple people over there to search that. And they gave us this explanation in writing. And then a couple weeks later, they came back and said, we've consulted with our, quote, subject matter expert. They didn't tell us who it was. And that warehouse doesn't exist. And so I explained this to the judge that, they told us they would go search this warehouse for these missing documents, and then they came back and said the warehouse they referred to doesn't exist. And the judge, to his credit, said, well, it's going to be kind of hard for the agency to walk back from that one. And the reason he said that is it's an example of what the law says is a reason for allowing discovery in a FOIA case: inconsistent or difficult to believe agency explanations. And this was an example of one of those. So the judge suggested we file a motion for discovery. He suggested it even before I asked him, and it was on my list to ask, but he's a pretty bright judge and he got to the point right away. So we did file a motion, to make a long story short, asking to depose 10 people, including an author of the FEMA report, the NIST report, the person who did the photographs or that are missing, the person who did the video that's missing, folks who signed the documents indicating that the CDs existed that were transferred that they haven't produced. And we're waiting to hear whether the judge is going to allow us to do those depositions and to also do interrogatories and document requests. Now, the reason I call that a breakthrough is because it's rare in FOIA cases to get this opportunity to do this type of discovery. And in cases related to 9/11, it's pretty much unprecedented up till now for any court letting discovery be done to develop more evidence regarding 9/11 issues. Now, it shouldn't be rare, in my view, but it has been rare. And so this may be one of the first times the subpoena power is able to be used to look at some of these issues. Now, we're limited. This is a FOIA case. It's not a broader, like, terrorism lawsuit. So we're limited to the issues related to the missing documents. But they do go to the core of the studies done on the building collapses. So it should be an interesting case to see through. And we'll keep you updated as that develops. So those are that's the gist of the recent legal developments. I also want to talk to you about what we're thinking about in the Lawyers Committee about future strategies and how we may be able to make some progress bringing more of the truth out and eventually perhaps bringing some wrongdoers to account that haven't been held to account yet. Let me just check and see how I'm doing on my time here. Okay, we're okay. So let me start with the FOIA for a moment. The Freedom of Information Act, which I've explained to you briefly, has been used in the past on 9/11 issues, and some interesting things have actually been acquired without suing, and there are some interesting FOIA lawsuits going on at the moment. One of them has to do with one of the suits or appeals going on at the moment has to do with the put options. I don't know how many of you heard about the put options, but it's a form of securities trading, but it's sort of the opposite of what you're normally acquainted with. Normally when you invest in securities, you put money in a company you hope to do well, and your stock will go up. A put option, in my view, a form of legalized gambling, is the opposite. You buy a put option and you make money if the stock goes down. Okay? Don't ask me. I didn't write the law.
Are you saying put off?
No, PUT, it's shorthand. There's probably actually a more technical name for it. I'm not a securities trader. I can't help you with the details of that. But shortly before 9/11, millions of dollars were invested in put options on some of the airlines that were involved in the tragedy and some of the companies whose offices were hardest hit by the tragedy, which is highly suspicious. And of course, their stock did go down, and money was made on those put options. The 9/11 Commission recognized that this had happened, and unlike the building collapses, which they pretty much ignored, they did address this issue briefly, but they said we looked into it, we identified who bought the put options, and because they were not connected to the terrorists, the hijackers, we decided it wasn't relevant. You have to sort of let that sink in for a minute. I mean, well, what about if there were others involved besides the hijackers? Was that not of interest to the 9/11 Commission? Apparently not.
Who were those people?
That information hasn't been released. It's a good question. I would like to know the answer. I think it may be that one of the bigger investors has come out one way or the other, and I don't want to say the name without going back and confirming, because it would be not a flattering thing to say about a company. I wouldn't want to get it wrong. I'll look it up and maybe send it to Fran or others if you want to follow up and see if I can put my finger on that. But a lot of that information hasn't been released. It's been requested, which is why I mentioned it. There's been a FOIA request now to find out the answer to your question, and that initial request was denied and is being appealed.
And just for the camera, could you repeat what his question was and future questions?
I will. Good point. Videographers sensitive to these things. The question was, who is it that invested in these put options? And I don't know with certainty a name that I could tell you in the moment that's been verified, but there may be one name out there, and I've forgotten how it got out. And the names were requested in a FOIA request by someone working with our organization, and it was initially denied or denied in substantial part. And an appeal is pending on that, not a lawsuit, an administrative appeal. So we may be asked to do a lawsuit on that, and we'll see how that goes. But that's an example of an area of interest. I'm not telling you yet, without seeing the records, what it all means. But what I don't understand is why the federal government wouldn't already want to have gotten to the bottom of that. And that begs a question in itself. But that's one area where FOIA can be helpful. Now, we did some FOIA requests from my local group in Indiana. I'm from Bloomington, Indiana. We have a local 9/11 group there. And we did some FOIA requests. And one of them was to the FAA. One of the useful things we got from the FAA was the flight data recorder data, which allowed simulations to be run on the flights of the airplanes. And we gave that information to an organization called Pilots for Truth, and generally made it available. I think it's still on our website, the Bloomington 9/11 Working Group website, if you want to see it. Now, we also got an interesting document that you wouldn't have expected. And the document had to do with, we asked for records on the hijackers. And one of the records we got back, even though they, strangely enough, they wouldn't give us a lot of the records claiming privacy, even though these folks are supposed to have died in the plane crashes. So how is there a privacy interest to be protected for someone who's died in the crashes, not to mention the fact they were criminals or terrorists if the official story is true. So a lot of the records we still haven't seen. But one of the records they gave us said that there was an application for a medical exam to renew a pilot's license for one of the hijackers. Now that might not seem startling because you have to do that to get your license, except the date on it was after 9/11. That's the significance. How could you have someone who theoretically, supposedly died in the crash, getting a medical exam for renewing a license after the supposed death in the crash? Now, we haven't got the answer yet, but that's something we would like to get an answer to. That's an example of interesting things one can find by using the Freedom of Information Act. You don't always get the good stuff. I'm still getting responses, apologies from like the CIA, the DOD, the DIA on our FOIA requests because they've taken like 11 years to respond. Now, we haven't had a huge budget to litigate, but I think that's probably, we're hoping that will change in the short term. It hasn't changed yet, sorry to say. But we're hoping to generate some funds for a FOIA campaign. So that's one of the areas we're looking at for the future. Because some of the stuff you just aren't going to get unless you sue. In our, I think I can speak safely for our committee, we're all dedicated to making sure that the full truth of what happened here comes out at a minimum for the benefit of the family members of the victims. But, the rest of us have a right to know as well, and it has huge implications. It already has had huge consequences. We've had a number of wars done in the name of 9/11. I don't know how to count the financial cost or the cost in lives or in our constitutional rights that have been narrowed on the excuse of 9/11. But, we paid a big price. The question is, should we have? And must we continue to do that? And so even though a lot of folks might say, it's 15 years later, let it go, it's a dead issue, it's an old issue, it's not worth the effort. Well, it's still very much a live issue to us because it still impacts whether our government has integrity. It still impacts whether we should be paying for wars and having our young people die in wars. And it really, has huge implications for the future of our democracy. Yes, sir.
It bears on the legitimacy of our government.
I
And
agree.
for me, 9/11 was a turning point. It's not that I was a fool before that, but I'm sorry, anybody involved in our government now is malfeasant to some extent, and they are rejecting evidence that is so in your face existent, and they will not admit it. They're in a mythology.
Thank you. I won't try to repeat all of that, but I think you spoke loud enough maybe to be caught. But your point is well taken that one of the significant implications of this 15 years of obstruction of the truth by our own government is not only whether there might have been crimes uninvestigated and unprosecuted, for example, regarding the building destruction, but have there been crimes related to obstruction of justice by members of the government themselves in preventing the public from getting to the truth. So one of the areas we expect to look at as the Lawyers Committee in the future, assuming we can raise some money or do it the hard way on the way we're doing it at the moment, which is volunteer time, we hope to investigate these issues of obstruction of justice before 9/11 and after 9/11. There were, some of there were whistleblowers who came forward either before 9/11 or shortly after 9/11 who disclosed some insights into problems in the FBI and the DOD and the FAA in terms of how 9/11 was handled. And one of those whistleblowers was an FBI agent and attorney, Colleen Rowley, who some of you have heard about. And she has important information, which I think is still significant today, because no one's really ever investigated the concerns that she raised. And one of the concerns that she raised was, she's the one who was involved with her colleagues in Minnesota in investigating Moussaoui, who was arrested shortly before 9/11, the alleged 20th hijacker. And she attempted to subpoena his laptop before 9/11 to get information to see if there was, a conspiracy, a plan that might be prevented. She didn't know what was going to happen at that time. That happened shortly thereafter. But as she explains in a letter that's public and on the web these days that she sent to, I think, the Attorney General at the time, she was obstructed and was denied the subpoena until after 9/11. And so had she been given the subpoena when she requested it, they might have gotten leads that would have prevented some aspects of 9/11 or all of it in terms of following those leads. And she is pretty explicit in criticizing her superiors and certain of them in, without justification, preventing her from doing her job. There was also this Phoenix memo, some of you may have read about, from an FBI agent in Arizona. He was talking about his observation of a number of foreigners taking flight lessons who he was concerned might be planning a terrorist attack using airplanes prior to 9/11. And he wrote that memo to headquarters, and that memo was not shared with Colleen Rowley. And had she had it at the time, she could have made a better case for getting her subpoena at the time, because that's what she was concerned about from what she was seeing in Minnesota. So the question is it coincidental that people in headquarters in the FBI were not facilitating the work of their field agents in trying to get to the bottom of an apparent plan before it was carried out? Is it a coincidence and just ineptitude, or is it something more than that? And you can see today that the Congress is able to start investigations when they choose and hire special prosecutors and so forth. And you would think that with the evidence we're looking at, there are a number of areas, we've mentioned 2 or 3, the buildings, the put options, the obstruction in the FBI. Why haven't we had that sort of investigation for 15 years? And the answer I'm sure the government would give us is, that's what the 9/11 Commission was for. But if you go back and study what the commission did, and particularly if you look at the critique by the family members, the 9/11 Commission ignored more than it addressed. And so it really wasn't an objective investigation. And there are a lot of indications that it was itself obstructed by key staff members who had an agenda to prevent the truth from coming out. Another area we hope to look at some point.
I want to know what you feel about I'm thinking about Trump, current President Trump. What is he doing over in Saudi Arabia right now? How is that figuring into all of this? What's your feeling about it?
Well, lawyers aren't supposed to go on feeling, but we have feelings nonetheless. My immediate reaction to that is that until the sort of investigation that I just referenced is done, a real independent, thorough investigation, including of the 28 pages and the Saudi connection, we shouldn't be selling our state-of-the-art military equipment to the tune of a number of billions of dollars to them. That's just me. The cart's before the horse there. You need to know who your enemies are and who your friends are before you start, selling weapons. And previous administrations committed to not just not doing business with, but actually sanctioning anyone who aided terrorists. And the real question is, not should we be selling them weapons, but what else should we be doing to sanction them if they were responsible? And until we know the answer to that, my view is that Trump's current activities are premature. Are there immediate questions? Up here in front? By the way, when you ask me my feeling, I'm not speaking for the Lawyers Committee. I'm speaking for just myself, just to be clear.
Yeah, just tagging on John's question. One of the things that stops people from even being able to see the controlled demolition aspect of the 9/11 truth movement is the massive amount of evidence for hijackers, including, for example, Saudi Arabia funding these people and warnings from many governments.
Right.
How do you sort that out?
Well, I don't see that inconsistent with,
It's a psychological thing. Because there's hijackers, how could there possibly be controlled demolition? But how do you?
It's a good question.
How do you answer people like that?
well, I'm about to do that now, I guess. So the short answer is that there's nothing in the laws of man or nature that prevent two conspiracies happening at the same time, or one conspiracy piggybacking on another. Now, whether the same entities were involved in organizing the plane hijackings as planted explosives, I don't know the answer to that now, and we should know the answer to that by now, but we don't. And that's because we haven't had a real investigation. But that's something that we're hoping to look into ourselves. And I should mention now, and I'll finish answering your question, but one of the projects we're trying to get to as a lawyers committee, in addition to the FOIA campaign, is a petition for a federal grand jury. And it's in the draft stage. So we expect to file it before too long. And we hope to get a grand jury to answer questions like who planted the explosives, were there explosives, who planted them, were they involved with the plane hijackers, or are they simply independent and committing their own crimes for their own reasons. So that's in the works. Now, in this case, there is a theory, and we haven't finished our investigation, so I'm not giving you a conclusion yet. I'm not giving you my own conclusion yet. As lawyers, we have to follow the facts and the evidence to wherever they lead, apply the law to them, and then draw a conclusion. We're not there yet. But hypothetically, if members of the American government in the late 1990s, 2000, 2001, before 9/11, and their contacts in the military-industrial complex had intelligence, advanced intelligence, that an attack was coming, and you don't get attacks like this, even if it's just the hijackers and the planes and Osama in a cave, you still don't get those sort of attacks overnight. It takes planning, typically years of planning. And generally, in this modern era of surveillance, those attacks, the planning of those attacks are hard to keep secret from intelligence agencies. So hypothetically, if the planning of these attacks were discovered in advance and some entities with an agenda of their own, for example, maintaining American military dominance worldwide for another several decades, decided that the only way to get the American public to support more wars and the extension of American military power at great expense, both in lives and money, was to create a, quote, new Pearl Harbor, an event like Pearl Harbor that would have that type of dramatic impact on the American psyche, then they could have planned to piggyback on those airplane attacks, not only allowing them to happen, maybe getting obstacles out of the way so they would happen, but making sure that they were dramatic enough to have the desired effect. The desired effect being shocking and awing the American public in this case, to the point where we would support invading Afghanistan and Iraq, regardless of any connection, found or unfound, to Iraq, because we were just so terrified and horrified. So that is a plausible theory. I'm sorry to say there's evidence supporting it, but it's not something that I have concluded yet is true or provably true, but it is something that we're looking at. Now those buildings, for those of you who have seen the presentations by the architects and engineers or the scientists on the buildings, very persuasive evidence. And let me give you the short version, and then we'll take another question if my computer will assist me, which it may or may not. It's going to be quicker for me to do this from memory. So there are certain types of evidence that the architects and engineers and chemists and physicists and mathematicians have brought forward on the building collapses that go well beyond suggesting explosives. One of them is chemical analyses of dust samples showing the presence of high-tech explosive residue. And that's not suggestive. I mean, if the FBI found that in a case they were trying to prosecute, it would be dispositive, basically, you know. And then you've got, for periods of time in the collapses, upper stories falling at free fall speed for part of the time, which is impossible. And these are floors that are impacting floors below the point of the plane collapse. There's no reason under the official story for the floors below the plane collapse to be other than intact when those upper floors hit them. They might have been, you know, heated, but they would still be intact, maybe somewhat weakened, but they hadn't collapsed due to the planes because the planes hit above. So what happens when a floor falls and hits a floor below that's intact? Well, either it stops the collapse or it slows it down and it continues to go. You can't free fall while encountering resistance. That's physically impossible. So that evidence, again, isn't suggestive, it's really dispositive, standing alone. You've also got these little metal microspheres which have been found in the dust, and it takes extremely high temperatures to create them. And jet fuel doesn't burn that hot. Building contents don't burn that hot, but high-tech explosives and incendiaries do, like thermite and thermate, which is what the residue was found in the dust. So, and there are like 20 points like this, okay? And maybe one or two of them would be dispositive in a normal, you know, criminal or civil case. And yet we don't even have an investigation acknowledging the possibility that explosives were used. And that, to me, is hard to explain. And that's what we're addressing in our petition for a grand jury. Now, I was telling you that for a reason.
I think you were supporting the controlled demolition, but there is this thing about the hijack.
Thank you. You got me back on track. So why did I tell you that? Someone had to plant those explosives, and they're fairly high-tech explosives, and it couldn't be done overnight. There had to be good access to the buildings. Hard to imagine that someone or someones could walk in for, you know, days or weeks on end with mysterious packages without the security knowing it. And so a good point to start the investigation on this part of it is to look at who controlled the security for the buildings, what the residents of the buildings observed during the weeks leading to 9/11 or months. And there were some folks who reported unusual and suspicious activity in the buildings. There were contracts for repairs on the elevators, which is where some of the experts say explosives would have to be planted. So there is something to investigate. There are people who could be deposed, and that would probably lead to, you know, other witnesses, and, you know, you could follow the chain. It's not impossible, in my view, that a foreign entity would have the financial capability to influence a company to get access to a building. So it's not actually impossible that the same people who flew the planes also controlled putting the explosives. It's not impossible, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the reason it doesn't make a lot of sense it would happen that way is if you could bring the buildings down by the explosives, which is what the scientific evidence has happened, why bother hijacking the planes? Why do that at all? Well, not if you're really hijackers. You can be bombers. Terrorists are bombers just as easily as they are hijackers. I mean, they're going to die or they're going to be criminals either way. It's you know, if the official story is correct that we're talking about foreign terrorists, it doesn't matter to foreign terrorists whether they bring the building down by hitting them with airplanes or by using explosives, except you can't really bring them down by hitting them with airplanes. But if you want to create, and I'm sorry to say it this way, I don't know any way to be other than direct about it. If you want to create a large loss of life to horrify and terrify the American public, planes hitting the buildings and the buildings standing and letting them be evacuated doesn't get the job done. And I'm sorry to say it that way. So the evidence is consistent with an entity other than foreign terrorists, or perhaps in complicity with foreign terrorists, arranging for explosives in the buildings. And that is something we think there needs to be a grand jury on to get to the bottom of it. Yes. Microphone?
Do we know why or who redacted the 28 pages? I mean, that report came out in 2002, before the invasion of Iraq, and Les Jameson made it the point that if we would have known what those pages said, it would have been really hard to justify invading Iraq as compared to Saudi Arabia. So, did you know who or why, or what was the justification for the redactions?
And by the redactions, you mean essentially redacting out the 28 pages and keeping them secret?
Yeah.
Okay, there's a second redaction issue. I'll tell you about it in a moment. But the first one you're talking about is keeping the 28 pages in toto basically secret. My understanding is that intelligence agencies communicated with members of the congressional committees and indicated their desire that that information be kept secret. And that may have been all the way up to the president, but it was the executive branch. Now, based on my analysis of the Constitution, the executive branch didn't have that authority to classify that information or prevent it from being disclosed. The members of the congressional committees either didn't know their own constitutional authority to handle release of their own documents, or they pretended not to know. And they allowed the executive branch to basically coerce them into classifying something that the executive branch had no authority to classify. That's my view of it. So, but it appears to be the executive branch's initiative with some, how shall we say, cooperation from certain members of Congress. And the other members of Congress, I think, just didn't know any better. I mean, even though there's a common belief that every person in Congress is a lawyer, that's not actually true. A lot of members of Congress aren't lawyers, and a lot of them don't know the law very well, no offense intended, because they're not trained. So a lot of them probably don't know about what's called the Journal Clause of the Constitution, which says that every act of Congress, all of the congressional business has to be published and made available to the public unless the Congress itself determines secrecy is required. Now, in this case, Congress did not determine secrecy was required. The executive branch did. And how do I know that? We have the cover letters from the committees to the entire Congress transmitting their report, noting they were withholding these 28 pages, okay, and they said, we're going to ask the executive branch agencies to declassify them. Why? Because we as Congress don't think they need to be secret. You don't ask to declassify something you believe needs to be secret. So at the time, the decision was made to keep these 28 pages secret for 15 years. The initiative was the executive branch, who had no authority to do it. The Congress indicated on the record they wanted that information to be declassified, but they apparently didn't know enough about the law to know how to go about doing it. All they had to do was release it. They had the authority to release it. They didn't need to go to the executive branch. So it's not an encouraging story about the competence of the United States government, sorry to say. Either that, or there was more complicity than we even know about for keeping that information secret. Before we go to the question in the back with Eileen, we'll get to Eileen next, but let me finish one thought. There is another redaction issue. Even though they have released the bulk of the 28 pages now, there are still some blacked out portions of the 28 pages. Some of those may be legitimate to protect, for example, an intelligence source or something. But it's not clear to me that that's a dead issue. There may be another round in terms of getting more of that released. Question?
Hi, my name's Eileen Evans. I volunteer with both Colorado 9/11 group and the Lawyers Committee. For those of you who don't know, they have a petition online, support legal action on 9/11 at last, for the grand jury. And I have it here on my computer just in case anybody wants to sign it. My question relates to the contracts the Pentagon has awarded right after 9/11. I read in David Ray Griffin's book that there's some research being done on Halliburton and other companies that, could you do a FOIA case on where the money went from the Pentagon to justify the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and who owns those companies and those stocks?
It's a good question. So the question was, could you do a Freedom of Information request and maybe follow-up appeal and litigation to find out where all the money went for the contracts post 9/11 that resulted from 9/11, particularly the military contractors? The answer is yes, you could do that. You probably would find out the company's name and the amounts. You may not find out every detail of how the money was spent. Some of it may be considered classified if it's certain types of weapons, for example. But a lot of that is FOIA-able. Now, short of a FOIA, you may get some of that online already. There is a contract database or two online. One of those databases is government-run. The other is a private-run by a nonprofit, I believe. And so you can do a Google search for government contracts, and you actually can put in a company name and dates, and it'll list the contracts the company has received. Now, whether it gives all the answers that you're looking for, I don't know, but it would be a good starting point, and it might set up a FOIA request to get more additional detail. Other questions in the moment? Yes, sir. Over here? Oh, sorry, there's one.
Thank you. My name is Tom Carlin, and this has been very, very interesting. And I have a couple of questions, and one has to do with the put options. And has your lawyers committee asked a financial type person, stock market type person, to look at the patterns of put options where you gamble on a stock going down, and I think the opposite side is a call option where you gamble with somebody else's money on a stock going up in value. Have you asked a financial type, isn't this common activity all the time where hedge funds, private equity money is in the market all the time buying put and call options? And what I'm getting at from a legal standpoint, is this a very fruitful area to pursue as far as adding a puzzle?
It's a good question.
Piece to the puzzle.
So let's do that, and then we'll come back to your next question. So stand by. So the first question is it an area useful for spending our limited resources and looking at the put option question when there may be a lot of gambling going on generally in the stock market? I think there probably is a lot of gambling going on in the stock market. I've heard about put options unrelated to 9/11. So I think if one looked at the volume of put options, you would see there are a lot of put options happening that have no relation to 9/11. However, there's been some analysis of these particular put options, and the Security and Exchange Commission actually has a formula and a computer program and a way of looking at suspicious transactions, okay? And it comes down to, how much more happened in this time period for this company than normally happens for other companies or this company also. And I could be wrong about this, but my recollection is that has been done to some extent on the put option for 9/11, and that they turned out to be highly suspicious because it was a very large increased jump in the volume of put options shortly before 9/11, and it was these particular put options. So even though in other circumstances your point might be correct that this might turn out to be not suspicious because it happens in other contexts and it might be a coincidence, the initial evidence is not so in this case, that this is a worthy area of inquiry. So I think there's another question here, and then we'll go back.
Have you run across in your requests to get evidence and information the response that, oh, well, this person who was responsible for this information or putting this in the warehouse, that person retired 5 years ago, or even worse, that person was walking down the streets of Washington, D.C. and was shot down just recently. So sorry, we the person who is responsible for that is gone, we can't go any further?
Not yet. And it may be that we're not at that stage where that has had an opportunity to happen a lot yet. It might happen in our the FOIA case I mentioned to you that is ongoing. Unlikely, because the communications that happened about this warehouse that disappeared and the documents, that was a recent communication. So it would be highly suspicious if that person retired or died. We don't know the answer yet. So I'll let you know how that one turns out. Now, there have been folks who have died, I'm sorry to say, who have been witnesses to events in 9/11. One of them, Barry Jennings, I believe was his name, was trapped in Building 7 and was rescued, thankfully. And he gave testimony that is not consistent with the official story, which is that there were explosions when he was in the building prior to its collapse, and that when he was taken out by rescuers, he was walking over and stepping on bodies. And that's not part of the official story for Building 7. He unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. So I don't know the details of that, but that's an example of where a key witness has now become unavailable to us. A question in the back.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison, for your dedication and work on this issue. There are many whistleblowers that have been silenced. John O'Neill, FBI agent, Sibel Edmonds, Robert Wright, FBI, Lieutenant Colonel Schaefer, who was investigating Able Danger, and that whole investigation was shut down. Kurt Sonnenfeld, who is the FEMA videographer. Of course, you mentioned Barry Jennings and Colleen Rowley. So we know the tactics to silence these whistleblowers. And you mentioned put options, but most of the put options go through the Wall Street banks, and we know many of the Wall Street bankers are former high-level CIA officials, including CIA directors such as Buzzy Krongard. And there's also the financial trades that were happening in the World Trade Center buildings during the actual destruction of the buildings, and then the gold in the basements of the buildings. So it's more than just the put options. So my concern is we're going after FOIA and approaching government agencies, seeking transparency and accountability and seeking justice and truth. But isn't that a bit like going to the Fox house to have the Foxes release information about the chickens they just killed? So we've got JFK, Kennedy's assassination, RFK, Robert Kennedy, JFK Jr., Martin Luther King's. All of these assassinations have not been publicly revealed, even though we have William Pepper, the attorney, who came forward in the civil lawsuit on wrongful death and proved that there was in fact a conspiracy. So is it fruitless? Are we not gaining any traction? Is there no teeth in approaching government agencies, expecting them to be forthcoming with evidence that would incriminate themselves?
Yeah.
Because the evidence is way beyond a hypothesis. It's clear that these were controlled demolitions.
I understand your question, and it's a good one. So the short version of the question is there a lot to be gained by putting energy and effort into a new government investigation when you're really asking the government to produce evidence that may incriminate itself? The question is actually more complicated than that. We've had changes of administrations over the years, so we don't have everybody in place now that was in place then. I can tell you that for 25 years I've been representing whistleblowers. That's what I do, and protecting them have had good success helping them both expose what they blew the whistle on and to get their jobs back when they've been fired for doing the right thing. There are good people in the government. They aren't always in charge of the government, but there are good people in the government. And I think there's still potential for whistleblowers to come forward, for example, either who were in the government at that time or who still are. Now, if we do this petition for a grand jury, for example, which is an example of the strategy you're talking about, can we expect anything to come from it, given that we're really asking for the government to do an investigation that may lead to some very embarrassing moments for the government itself? I don't know the answer yet on that, but in terms of why I'm still working on it and volunteering my time to do it, why do I think it's worthwhile? It's more pragmatic and more technical. Being a lawyer, I get that way. But one specific reason is there's a statute, a federal statute, that says that the U.S. attorney or the DOJ attorney who receives information from anyone, including any of you or me, that a crime may have been committed, has an obligation to relay to the grand jury that he's received information that a crime may have been committed and who he received it from. Now, that language is stated in a mandatory way, and that matters in the law. Statutes that say may are not generally enforceable. Statutes that say shall generally are enforceable. There is a mandamus law, federal statute, which says if a government official fails to perform a mandatory duty, as distinguished from a discretionary duty, any of us can sue that official to mandate that they do the mandatory duty. There may be some standing questions. You have to show that somehow it's related to your interest. But one reason we're pursuing this strategy at the moment, which might be a bit tactical, understanding the concern you raise, is that we intend in our petition to attach the evidence on the controlled demolitions, affidavits from scientists and so forth, and we expect to hold the U.S. attorney to the statutory duty to share that information with the grand jury and to tell the grand jury that we gave it to them, the lawyers committee. And then the grand jury could, if it chose in its wisdom, invite us, the lawyers committee, to present directly to the grand jury. The U.S. attorney could ask us to give them more information as well to present to the grand jury. Now, I can't tell you in advance how that whole adventure is going to turn out. Your caution is well taken, generally. But I've had enough success suing the government over the years that I haven't given up on it. And because I have this option to put some pressure on the U.S. attorney if the U.S. attorney doesn't do his or her job in relaying this to the grand jury, I think this is a viable vehicle for us to pursue. It isn't a panacea. It's a piece of the strategy. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'd like to, my name's Leroy Cockrell, and I'm interested in, you were talking about how the executive branch could hijack the Congress. And
I didn't use that word, but I understand why you're using it.
Yes, I'm just saying buffalo them or whatever you want to, there's a lot of good terms.
Understood.
And there's two concepts that I'd like to employ in my question. One of them is a concept called willful blindness, where people, it's not that they don't see the elephant in the room, it's that everybody sees the elephant in the room, and they insist on keeping their head buried in the sand, and they don't want to speak up because they feel like it exposes them as whatever, somebody that's illogical or whatever the reason. And
Conspiracy theorist, yes, I know the problem.
Yes. And of course, then there's the other thing that was exposed by a fellow named Jonathan Haidt, and that is the difference between liberals and conservatives, where he examined the attributes that each group holds sacred. And for conservatives, the number one thing that they hold sacred is loyalty. And whereas on the liberal side, that's rather low on their list because they want to know the truth. They say, well, will the truth please stand up? We want to identify.
That may have been the case at one point in history, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, yeah, you might make that argument too. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's always that way.
I understand.
But the preponderance of the evidence suggests that. So anyway, I'm just kind of saying that I question when you have a group of people like the Congress that are extremely loyal to a leader who may or may not be logical and ethical or whatever. It's a prescription for bad things to happen.
I understand that.
And so I guess my question is, I wonder if anybody's even considered some of those ideas.
Well, I think they're being considered as we draft strategies and craft strategies for trying to solve a fairly intractable problem, which is 9/11, the fact that we're now 15 years after the fact, still talking about how to get at the truth suggests it is intractable. That doesn't mean it's impossible. And, there are a lot of reasons why folks don't come forward on this type of issue in the government or outside of the government. This isn't exactly a career builder even for a lawyer, okay? Just want to mention that. So, you have to have a value system that places the truth over other things, or democracy over other things, or integrity in government over other things. And our committee, I think, has that value set, and that's why we're doing what we're trying to do. But historically, there have been times when people should have spoken out, not just in the U.S. government, but in other governments worldwide, and they haven't, timely, and disasters have happened. And we may be approaching another era of that type, I'm sorry to say, and I hope we're not. So I understand the problem. But, my view is that, as I think it was Margaret Mead that said, never doubt that a small group of dedicated people can change the world, because, in fact, that's the only way it's ever happened. And I feel like we're in that mode at the moment. I think this is such a group in the moment. Our committee is such a group. What we're trying to do, and what I'd like to do, and I'd like you all to stay in this dialogue, those of you who are still concerned about this, I'd like to build the connections between our committee and the state groups and develop a better coordinated network for investigating and advocating on this issue. We're going to need some of that for the legwork to do the petition for a grand jury. If we get into actual litigation, we're going to need that. And we need it to some extent on the David Cole FOIA suit, particularly if we get our discovery. We're not funded at the moment. I mean, you might think that lawyers group must have money. We're not actually that kind of lawyers. We're not the big lawyers who make zillions of dollars, or companies suing each other, or other ways they make millions of dollars in the stock market. We're mostly public interest or general practice, and we're looking to be funded from the outside. So until we are, our power is going to come from how much grassroots support we get. So we're going to need you all to help us. Any other questions?
Yeah. Oh, I think that Margaret Mead quote, I think she meant to say well-grouped, a group of well-financed.
Oh, well-financed.
Yeah, I think there was.
I missed that part.
She actually left that out on.
Probably an ellipse in there.
Joke.
Yeah.
My question actually kind of follows up with you. I've always been perplexed when you have such an apparent truth that the majority of people, refuse, like Fran was saying, refuse to look at, refuse to see. And one of the more important books that I read, helping me to understand a piece of this, some of it's social, like not wanting to be called a conspiracy theorist, but a lot of it's professionalism. And the book Disciplined Minds by Jeff Schmidt talks about, as a professional, like the more professional you are, be it, academic, whatever, there are these pressures put on you not to step outside of the orthodoxy. And so my question to you is, have you received any pressure from business being taken away, or maybe you have stories, a story that you could share with someone that you've worked with that have received some flack, or either some other professional pressure from regarding that?
Well, I haven't been pressured too much on this issue to my face. What's happening behind the scenes, hard to say. I've been doing this sort of work for 25 years. I'm probably known by now as not being someone who's easily pressured, because I've been representing whistleblowers for 25 years. Back in 1993, I believe it was, we were suing then Governor Bill Clinton. I was representing the Arkansas Peace Center and the Vietnam veterans, and we were suing to shut down an illegally operated Agent Orange incinerator that was poisoning the community. And we did get it shut down eventually, the hard way. We got a couple of injunctions from the court, and then the Court of Appeals, for reasons which remain mysterious, overturned those injunctions. But then we had like 12 whistleblowers come forward to the State Attorney General, and I coordinated that. And there was so much public embarrassment that EPA shut it down. However, while that was in progress, the company complained to the local prosecutor about me, because I had invited some of the whistleblowing workers to come and speak with the Attorney General of Arkansas about it. And the company accused me of impersonating the Attorney General of Arkansas, and the local prosecutor called me on the phone and said he had to restrain his deputy from coming over and arresting me. And I told him that would probably not be a good idea because I was not impersonating the Attorney General. The Attorney General actually interviewed and deposed these people with the court reporter under oath on the record, and their facts weren't quite right. And we had a nice front page story in the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette about that, and we neutralized that attempted pressure. And that's an example, and that was just one company with, putting pressure to solve their immediate problem. I've had clients in other areas shot at. I've had witnesses killed over the years. So, and this, what we're talking about now, the stakes are as big as anything I've ever dealt with. So, your question is a good one. I'm happy to report I haven't been the recipient of any foul play at the moment. I don't anticipate that. One of the best ways to avoid that is to be upfront and out there with what you know, so that there's nothing to be gained really, or not much to be gained from eliminating you because people already know what you found out. So we're not going to be very secret about what we're doing with the Lawyers Committee. We're trying to, like we're doing now, disseminate information so people will know.
I'm wondering, there were so many system failures, like would it make sense to contact the FAA and ask why those planes were even allowed to fly off course?
The failure to intercept and so forth?
Yeah, like why, usually the military would scramble when a plane goes off course.
Right.
Like those planes went off course.
Understood.
And, is there any...
Is there a basis for an investigation into that? The short answer is yes. I did a review, and some of my colleagues did a review of some of the audio tapes of the air traffic controllers and the FAA headquarters on 9/11, because we got those audio tapes in a FOIA through David Cole. And there were some interesting things on those tapes. And we haven't had the person power to go through them all yet. So anybody wants to volunteer to listen to some tapes and digest them for us, give us an email or a call. But the short version is, one of the things that struck me on those tapes was that they were talking with the CIA. This was real time during the attacks. They were talking about reports coming in of other hijacked planes, which didn't turn out to be among the 4 they admitted were hijacked. Now, how do you get a report of a hijacked plane without it actually being a hijacked plane? And in particular, how do you get a report of multiple hijacked planes on the same day in the same time frame? And all of those turned out not to be hijacks. There were also bomb threats on planes reported during this actual event, real time, all of which was confusing and distracting the people trying to deal with the real planes that were targeting the targets. Now, the question is that an everyday occurrence for the FAA? And I doubt it. Okay, how often does that happen in their history that they've had? And this is in addition to all the military training exercises that had planes in the air and hijacked planes in the air, real time, overlapping with the real attacks. And that created a sense of confusion that's basically unprecedented. To me, that is so irregular that it needs to be investigated. And so that's on our list. I mean, we're starting with the buildings, but the failure to intercepts, the crash or whatever it was in Shanksville, the Pentagon attacks, these are all fair game for investigation. No one independent has really given them a good look. And I'm not telling you what happened in those situations. I'm just saying they do deserve a thorough investigation. So we're getting close to our time. Other questions?
I just want to comment as a fellow lawyer about the courage and high quality of your investigation.
Thank you. So I'll pass that on to my committee board members. This is the team thing.
We haven't got him yet either.
Yes, sir?
I was curious if you're, in your suit, you were working with any kind of motive for the Saudi Arabian, and whether that's official government group or kind of a radical fringe group within Saudi Arabia that you're working with.
Okay, we're not doing that ourselves. The lawsuit against the Saudis, which I think is the one you're referring to, is another law firm. We're not yet involved with any litigation involving the Saudis. The Saudis being sued, though, include a number of Saudi officials. So the law firm leading that is the Motley Rice firm, I think. And I've read their complaint. I'm speaking from memory at the moment, but I believe they named a whole bunch of Saudis, several of which were current or former government or Saudi royal family members. So they're not just alleging a rogue element that happens to be in Saudi Arabia, although I think your question is actually a good one, because I think there needs to be an investigation not just of the official Saudis, but other folks who may have been operating out of Saudi Arabia. I mean, keep in mind, most of the hijackers under the official story were Saudis. People don't often remember that. And yet the Saudis got no attention at the time, and one reason was, of course, the 28 pages were kept secret. But I think the official Saudis merit some inquiry, but I think folks may be operating out of Saudi Arabia who may not be official Saudis. I mean, we have rogue people in our government and in our corporations. Not everything that happens at the hands of an American is an American government act, and that can be true for the Saudis as well. Do you have a follow-up on that? Or, no, okay. Yes.
I think we're getting toward the end.
We are?
I just want to say, too, I want to acknowledge Eileen in the back here. Eileen, you want to step forward? This very high-quality presentation would not have happened without Eileen. She did all the organizing and planning for it.
Thank you.
I just want to thank Eileen.
Thank you, Eileen. And by the way, while we're thanking people, I really was impressed with the fact that the Colorado 9/11 Truth Group got a program on public television. And I congratulate you all on that. I don't think any other group in the country has accomplished that. Very impressive. So I appreciate your efforts.
Mick, I have another
Yes, sir.
question, and I want to endorse what was said about, and I know you could use a lot more funding.
You could say that.
To pursue these things. And I want to endorse the idea of looking into the hijackings. There's so many elements of that that also don't ring true. But also there are media reports that were, to say the least, suspicious. One example, on 9/11, Tom Brokaw had on an alleged engineer, Hyman Brown from Boulder, who claimed to be an expert in building demolition. And it later turns out he really wasn't. And I think that's a subject that Tom Brokaw and I think it's NBC News might be asked about. How did they get information from about or from Hyman Brown that made him a supposed expert?
Well, you know, one of the, just in closing, one of the strangest things that happened on 9/11 was, it wasn't just the BBC, but the BBC is best known for it. There were several reporters who announced the collapse of Building 7 with a video of New York in the background and Building 7 still standing. So they announced its collapse before it happened. Now, you know, how does that happen? So that's an area that deserves inquiry. Now, there's Joe. Joe mentioned Robert Wright as one of the whistleblowers, and there were some others. Robert Wright, I believe, and Joe will correct me if I'm wrong, I believe he was investigating the financing of terrorism, and his investigation was shut down when it started focusing on the Saudis. So if you put that together with the keeping the 28 pages secret and sort of ignoring the obvious, which was most of the hijackers were Saudis, I mean, that's a valid area for continued inquiry. And I'll leave you with this fact, which you may or may not know, and that is, which I found very suspicious. Shortly after 9/11, General Wesley Clark was pulled aside by someone in the Pentagon and shown a memorandum. And he was told that this memorandum reflected a plan of the United States already drawn up shortly after 9/11. It was already drawn up to invade, and I think it said take down the governments of 7 countries in 5 years, or 5 countries in 7 years. 7 in 5 years. And those countries are pretty much the countries we've now seen military action in since 9/11. And that begs a lot of questions. So with that, I appreciate the chance to talk with you all. Yes?
One more very, very quick one.
Okay.
What motivates you? Money, obviously, right? No.
Oh, that's what it is.
I'm just curious, like, what drives you to, because it's not easy, it's not an easy road.
Well, a long story, started out, believe it or not, focusing on government accountability in college. I individualized my undergraduate major at University of Chicago and Indiana University on accountability in government and educational institutions because I was already convinced, probably because of the Vietnam War, that we needed reform and we needed to establish integrity in government and we needed ways of doing that. And I've been focused on that ever since. It led me to eventually to law school. I actually tried to reform the school system for about 10 years when there was an alternative school movement. And then I decided I would be more effective outside the bureaucracy and went to law school at the District of Columbia, a member of the founding class, public funded, public interest law school, one of the few in the country, grew out of the ashes of Antioch. And then I got the opportunity to work with the Government Accountability Project for my internship and, what am I trying to say, clinic work. And then they hired me after that to represent whistleblowers. That's how I got started in doing this, and I've been doing it ever since. But the short version is, I'm sort of the Ralph Nader mode. I believe we all should be public citizens. We should take our obligations as a member of a democracy seriously and do what we can to establish and maintain integrity. And I think it's commonly attributed to Thomas Jefferson, but probably came from someone else, maybe Thomas Paine, but we need to maintain that eternal vigilance if we expect to have a democracy. And it's an ongoing battle, and that's why I'm doing it.
Thank you.